Currently, we are using the authorize attribute without any parameters to force a user to authenticate themselves before they can reach the index action of the home controller and view this home page. And of course, like any action filter, I can also take the authorize attribute and apply it at the controller level. That means that a user would be forced to authenticate themselves for any of the actions in this controller. The authorize attribute also allows you to set some parameters to enforce authorization rules. So first we need to know the user's identity, and then we can say that only specific identities are allowed to access these actions. I can specify that using roles or users. So let's say that we only want to allow users named Poonam and Tim. Now what I'm going to do is build the application. We'll come back out here and I'll try to view the home page. And because I'm not one of those users, what the application should do is redirect me to the logon screen. It's not going to allow me to see that home action. But if I say Poonam and S. Allen and do a build, now I should have an identity that allows me to view that home page. Of course, you don't always have the luxury of hard-coding usernames into your source code, and that's why the authorize attribute also allows you to specify roles. Now, if you're using Windows authentication, roles would map to Windows groups on your server or groups configured in Active Directory. So you could put in something like domain name / group name. But we're using forms-based authentication, and it turns out ASP.NET also has a role provider that you can use to store and manage roles in a SQL Server database. This isn't configured into the application by default. So what we're going to have to do is first get the role manager up and running. And the easiest way to do that is to use this button in the Solution Explorer that launches the ASP.NET configuration tool. This is a tool that you're only going to use on your local development machine. It's going to look in the web.config for this application and use the same application services database as that forms authentication provider is using that we've already configured inside of there. If you have the kind of site where you need to constantly add users into roles and add roles and remove roles, you're probably going to want to look at building another controller that will allow you to manipulate roles. And the way you would do that is with the role provider class. I'm just going to point you to the documentation on MSDN. You can use this class to do things like add users to roles, create roles, delete roles. So you would build a controller and a set of views around that functionality. It could be very similar to the account controller and the way that works, in that it wraps the underlying ASP.NET provider and actually does all of this functionality through interface definitions. But what I will do to demonstrate some of the authorization features is use this tool to first enable roles. That's going to make a couple changes in our web.config file, which we will look at in just a bit. And then let's add a couple roles. So let's add administrators, and let's add a role called users. And then I could go in here and manage these roles, go and find and select users that I want to put in there. I can also come out and go to my list of users, of which we just have one, the one that I entered, S. Allen, and I could say edit roles. And what we'll do is we'll put S. Allen into the users role. And now these roles will be stored in the database where the user information is stored. We will also have a web.config file that has been modified. What will have been added is a role manager. The default provider here is going to be the ASP.NET SQL role provider. So again, it's storing information in SQL Server, and it's using a connection string of application services. And that's a place where we could change that to be, for instance, ode to FoodDB, and use the same database that all our restaurant information is inside of. And so now let's go to the home controller and say that we will only allow users in the administrator's role to view any of the actions of this home controller. And I can do a build and come back into our application and try to go to the home page. And as just a regular user, S. Allen is not going to be allowed to see that home page. It's going to send me back to the logon page. But if I say anyone who is both authenticated, and we know who they are, and they are in this user's role, they should be able to see the home page. And at that point, as S. Allen, I'm able to get back to the home page. To summarize what we've seen the authorize attribute by itself will force a user to authenticate themselves before reaching a controller action. and this works with both Windows authentication and Forms authentication. We can also tell the authorize attribute to only let specific users or users in specific roles into an area of the application. In this application, we enabled the ASP.NET SQL role provider to use roles in SQL Server, and the authorize attribute will happily work with the roles we've defined. One thing to keep in mind if you're using Forms authentication on an HTTP address, that the user is going to be entering their username and password. It's going to be transmitted to the server in plain text, meaning anyone who is capturing network traffic or sniffing the network might be able to pick up the user's credentials and steal them. The solution to this is to use HTTPS, a secure connection, to make sure that the username and password are encrypted. I want to show you a couple tricks that you can use to enable SSL with the IIS Express web server. The first step I'm going to take is turning on an SSL endpoint inside of IIS Express. Right now, if I show all the applications that are running, you can see Ode to Food is available. It's on a regular HTTP port at 49.237. What I want to do is also have an HTTPS endpoint. So to do that, I will click on the web project and press F4 to bring up the properties window. One of the properties in here that you can set is SSL enabled. It's false by default, but we will set that to true, and you can see this will be my SSL URL, HTTPS localhost port 44300. If you're familiar with SSL, then you'll realize that that is not the default HTTPS port. The default port is 443. It will take a little more configuration work to get IIS Express to use the default port. We'll come back to that later. But just by enabling that feature, I should be able to take this URL and paste it into my web browser, and I'm about to view my site over SSL. However, there's one more catch. IIS Express uses a self-signed certificate to encrypt the traffic, and by default, there are not going to be any browsers that trust that certificate. That's another problem that I will come back to later, but for now, I just want to continue to this website. I trust my local host, and there I can see Ode to Food operating underneath HTTPS. Of course, I really don't require HTTPS for the entire site. I really only require that when the user is viewing sensitive information or sending me sensitive information. For instance, in the case of the account controller, which quite frequently deals with usernames and passwords. And this is where the attribute comes in, the require HTTPS attribute. What this attribute will do is redirect any incoming requests that are not secure to an HTTPS address. And it is an action filter, and like any action filter, I could put that on specific actions, but I'm going to leave it at the controller level so it applies to all the actions inside the controller. And to see how this behaves, let's go to our home controller and turn off the authorization rule here, just so we can view the home page as an anonymous user. So let me build the site and do Control F5. We should be able to view the home page. And then once we view the home page, I want to log in. That will be a regular HTTP request, but the attribute that we put in place should redirect the request to use a secure connection. But there is a small problem here. That attribute by default is going to use port 443 for SSL, the default SSL port, and that is not where IIS Express is listening. There are several ways to solve this problem, but I want to demonstrate a solution that involves another feature of IIS Express and also of IIS, which is to put a URL rewriting rule inside of the system.webserver configuration section. This rule is a rule that I have already written and saved inside of Notepad so that I can copy it into the configuration file. Otherwise, I'd never be able to remember the regular expressions involved. And what this rule will do is match any incoming request that is destined for something that starts with account, like all the account controller URLs will do, and look for ones that do not have HTTPS turned on. In that scenario, it's going to use a regular expression to pull out the host name of the HTTP_host server variable to get just the host name without the port number, and then redirect the browser to that host with the SSL port number that we're using with IIS Express and include the rest of the URL from the original request. With this rule in place, I should be able to save the web.configuration file. And let's come back out and try this again. We're going to start at localhost on the home page on a regular non-secure link, and I'm going to click log on. and magically that's going to redirect me to the proper URL, including the port number. I still have a warning about the website's security certificate. We'll address that later. I'll show you some documentation on how to get around that. I'm just going to continue to the website, and now you can see all of this is working. So the rewrite rule could do this all by itself, but I'm going to leave the require HTTPS attribute in here just in case someone forgets to put this bit of configuration inside of the web.config file. We never want a user to be entering passwords over a plain text connection. And now we have a rewriting rule where we can adjust the port number to whatever we're using on IAS or IAS Express. Now, to answer some of the questions that we've avoided so far, how would I get IAS Express to use the regular HTTPS port or even the regular HTTP port 80? And how do I get the browser to trust the certificate that's installed in IAS Express? We're not going to be able to cover all those topics in this module, so I will point you to a blog by Scott Hansman. It's called Working with SSL at Development Time is Easier with IAS Express. And by easier, I think Scott means it's not impossible. You just need to know how to run a few tools from the command line that give IAS Express permission to run on port 443 and port 80. You also need to run some commands that will generate a certificate and bind that into IAS Express, and then also tell your browser to trust that certificate. So all the information that you would need to set up a better development environment is in this post.